Right, I've got my thinking cap on, which means we are about to go into the depths of a rabbit hole. I hope you're ready. We are going to dive into the Dubin family's connection to Jeffrey because it is a perfect example of how wealthy and powerful people enabled Jeffrey's depraved desires, even if it came at the detriment of their own children. Just the other day, we talked about how Jeffrey always had access to teens, babies, and children outside of the children that he was procuring to SA and allow his friends to SA for his own profit because of his friends who would often shamelessly bring their children around him, the sitting president included. And I want to specifically zero in on the Dubin family connection because this is like the epitome, the blueprint of how money can corrupt your ethics and your morality. I think that there are many parents who were in Jeffrey's network who behaved in this way. So let's start at the very beginning of this story. We're rewinding back to the 70s when a young Swedish woman who was about 18 years old named Eva Anderson was walking down the streets of New York when she caught the eye of two individuals, the founders of Ford Models, Eileen Ford and her husband, Gerald W. Ford. The couple thought Eva was absolutely stunning. They stopped her while she was walking down the street, began talking to her, and recruited her to become a Ford model. Working as a Ford model gave Eva a lot of opportunities, and she would eventually begin dabbling in the pageant world. Eva participated in Miss Sweden 1980, where she would take home the title, followed by her great success in Miss Universe 1980, where she would come in the fourth runner-up. At the height of Eva's success, she would cross paths with a figure who was becoming increasingly well known in New York City, Jeffrey. While we don't know for sure how these two actually met, Eva being a successful model in New York City and Jeffrey being a socialite, I imagine their social circles crossed paths at some point. The couple began dating in the early 80s and they would have an on-again, off-again romantic relationship for about 11 years. On top of being an already successful model, Eva had ambitions to become a physician, and Jeffrey would pay Eva's way through medical school, which allowed her to become a licensed physician in Sweden and the United States. Now, jumping forward a little bit to the early 1990s, a hedge fund and capital investment manager named Glenn Dubin saw Eva modeling in the page 6 section and was immediately smitten. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go too far into Glenn Dubin's background, but there is one thing that I want you guys to remember. In 1984, Glenn Dubin and his childhood friend started a capital investment management firm. In 2004, Glenn and his childhood friend's company was sold to JP Morgan for $1.3 billion. Just put a pin in that, because it'll be very important later. I won't go through Glenn's whole resume, but he has founded and funded many companies and foundations that involve oil, energy, medical, and scientific research. He's also a major political donor. He has donated in the past to Democratic presidential campaigns, and just recently, in this past presidential race, he donated $100,000 to Vivek Ramaswamy's Republican presidential campaign. Glenn Dubin is also a major donor to Harvard. Just keep that also in the back of your mind. Referring back to the timeline, when Jeffrey and Eva were in a relationship, before Glenn had ever laid eyes on Eva, Glenn Dubin was in a relationship and briefly married to a woman named Elizabeth Saltzman. And Elizabeth Saltzman is a well-known stylist, and she got her big break into the industry when she began working at Vogue and Vanity Fair in the early 90s. If you're not familiar with the name Elizabeth Saltzman is a known close associate of Ghislaine Maxwell, and they have been very close friends since the early 90s at least. Here's an old newspaper clipping that discusses Elizabeth Saltzman just after her divorce from Glenn Dubin. Their marriage was very short-lived. It was only about 2 years long. And I don't know if you guys can see, but in this article, editor of Vogue, Anna Wintour, even comments about how well-connected Elizabeth Saltzman is and how she seems to know everybody. Here's a newspaper clipping from the Daily Sun circa 1992, in which we can see Ghislaine Maxwell, Elizabeth Saltzman, Russell Simmons, and many others were seen partying together alongside Ford Models, the same modeling agency that scouted Eva Anderson walking down the streets of New York City. Here's another newspaper clipping from 1995 where Ghislaine Maxwell and Elizabeth Saltzman were seen partying together again. Here is Elizabeth Saltzman's name in the little black book that I think we have all began to understand was more likely Ghislaine's than Jeffrey's. Here's Elizabeth Saltzman with Prince Andrew. Here's Elizabeth Saltzman with Harvey Weinstein. Here's Elizabeth Saltzman with her boss, Graydon Carter, who was the editor of Vanity Fair from 1992 to 2017. And at this same event, we can see Ghislaine Maxwell with an obvious hairpiece hugging Graydon Carter while Harvey Weinstein lingers in the back. It is widely believed that Elizabeth Saltzman was Ghislaine Maxwell's kind of like foot in the door into the high fashion social circles as well as the entertainment social circles. And Elizabeth Saltzman is not the main focus of this situation, but I think that is a very interesting connection that was within the Dubin family. But after Glenn and Elizabeth Saltzman divorced, Glenn would see Eva modeling and wanted her. At this point in time, Eva was still close with Jeffrey. They were not in a romantic relationship at this time. Jeffrey's main girlfriend was Ghislaine Maxwell. Long story short, Glenn reached out to Eva. The two of them met, began a romance, and were married by 1994. The couple would then go on to have 3 children together: Selena Dubin, Jordan Dubin, and Maya Dubin. Even after Glenn and Eva had wed and began starting a family, they still remained very close with Jeffrey. They would party together, socialize together, and even do business together. Do you remember that JP Morgan Chase purchase of Glenn's company that we talked about earlier? The acquisition that made him a billionaire? Jeffrey was the one who was responsible for introducing Glenn Dubin to the CEO of JP Morgan Chase at the time, Jess Staley. And Jeffrey was the middleman who made the deal between Glenn Dubin and JP Morgan Chase that made Glenn Dubin a billionaire. And remember, this sale happened in 2004, so Glenn and Eva had been married for at least 10 years and had 3 children at this point. Out of the over $1 billion that Glenn was paid for this acquisition, Jeffrey was paid $15 million by Glenn Dubin for simply facilitating the deal. Jeffrey made these people billionaires, and because of that, he walked around with the presumption that the Dubin family was indebted to him. Not just indebted to him at the highest level, in the form of their firstborn daughter. Go to part 2 and I will explain to you how Eva and Glenn failed their children for the love of money.